April 16, 1945, Weimar, Germany. 800 hours. The morning was bright and cold. Spring sunlight cut through the trees along the road that led northeast out of the city. The air smelled of wet earth and pine and something else, something carried on the wind from 4 miles away that the people walking could not yet identify. There were over 1,000 of them, men and women from Weimar, ages 16 to 65, moving in a loose column under American guard. They walked in silence. Some carried handkerchiefs. Some wore their church clothes, the same outfits they had worn 2 days earlier for Palm Sunday services. They had been told to assemble at the town square at 700. They had been told they were going on a mandatory walk. They had not been told where. The guards were soldiers from the 80th Infantry Division. They walked alongside the column with rifles slung, not pointing at anyone, not threatening, just present. Captain Harold Miller, 29, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, led the detail. He had been given his orders the night before by a colonel who had received them directly from General Omar Bradley's headquarters. The orders were simple. March every able-bodied adult in Weimar to Buchenwald. Make them see everything. Do not let anyone turn away. Miller had asked one question. What if they refuse, sir? The colonel's answer had been immediate. Then you arrest them. No one refused. The column moved slowly. Some of the older women struggled with the pace. The road was uneven, still muddy from recent rain. After an hour, the trees thinned and the camp came into view. Buchenwald sat on a hill called Ettersberg, surrounded by forest on 3 sides and open ground to the south. From a distance, it looked like a factory. Long wooden barracks arranged in neat rows. A tall fence. Guard towers. Smoke rising from a chimney near the center of the compound. It could have been a lumber mill or a gonghan or a military installation. Then the wind shifted and the smell hit them. Some of the women stopped walking. The guards motioned them forward. The column kept moving. The main gate was 100 yards ahead now. Iron bars with a slogan worked into the metalwork. Jedem das Sein. To each what he deserves. The words were visible from inside the camp, designed to be read by prisoners, not visitors. The gates were open. American soldiers stood on either side. Miller stopped the column just outside and turned to face them. His voice was calm and loud enough to carry. You are going to walk through this camp. You are going to see what was done here. You are not permitted to look away. You are not permitted to leave early. When you have seen everything, you will be escorted back to Weimar. Anyone who refuses will be detained. Do you understand? No one answered. Miller nodded to the guards, and the column began moving again. They entered Buchenwald. The first thing they saw was the roll call area, a wide plaza of packed dirt surrounded by barracks. Prisoners stood in clusters, watching the Germans file past. The prisoners wore striped uniforms that hung off skeletal frames. Their heads were shaved. Their eyes were flat. Some of them pointed. Some of them shouted in languages the townspeople did not understand. One man, a Polish prisoner named Tadeusz Sobolewicz, 21, from Warsaw, stepped forward and spat at the feet of a German woman walking near the front of the column. She flinched, but kept walking. The guards led them to the first barracks. Inside, the bunks were stacked 3 high, wooden slats with no mattresses, no blankets. Men lay on them, too weak to stand. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and sickness and human waste. A medic from the U.S. Army, Lieutenant Daniel Winters, 26, from Cleveland, Ohio, was moving between bunks with a clipboard, taking names, checking pulses. He looked up as the German civilians entered, his face unreadable. One of the women, Greta Holtz, 43, from Weimar, covered her nose with her handkerchief. A guard stepped forward. Put it down. She hesitated. The guard repeated himself, his voice flat. Put it down. She lowered the handkerchief and kept walking. They were led through 6 barracks. Then they were taken to the hospital block. The building was long and whitewashed, cleaner than the others, but what was inside was worse. This was where the medical experiments had been conducted. The rooms were small, each one fitted with a metal table, restraints, cabinets filled with instruments. On one table, there were still leather straps hanging loose. On another, there were stains that no amount of scrubbing had removed. A survivor, Dr. Victor Klein, 38, from Prague, Czechoslovakia, stood near the door. He had been a physician before the war. He had been forced to assist in the experiments. He had survived by being useful. Now he stood with his arms crossed, watching the Germans file through, and his face held an expression that was not anger. It was colder than that. One of the German men, Heinrich Bauer, 51, from Weimar, stopped in front of him. We did not know this was happening. Klein looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke in German, his voice quiet. You knew enough not to ask. Bauer did not reply. The column moved on. They were taken to the crematorium next. The building sat at the northern edge of the camp, a low brick structure with a tall chimney. The doors were open. Inside, there were 4 ovens, each one large enough to hold multiple bodies. The ovens were cold now, but the floors around them were covered in ash. On a metal cart near the wall, there were remains that had not yet been disposed of when the camp was liberated. Bones, skulls, fragments. The guards made the civilians stand in the room for 5 minutes. No one was allowed to leave. Some of the women were crying. Some of the men stared at the floor. Captain Miller stood near the door, watching them, his face expressionless. When the 5 minutes were up, he led them outside to the yard. This was where the orders had come from. Not from Miller, not from Bradley. From Eisenhower himself. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, had visited Buchenwald on April 12th, the same day he visited Ohrdruf. He had walked through the barracks, the hospital, the crematorium. He had seen the survivors. He had seen the dead. And when he returned to his headquarters, he had issued a direct order. Every German civilian living within 5 miles of a liberated camp was to be brought to that camp and forced to witness what had been done there. No exceptions. No excuses. The order was not optional. It was not a suggestion. It was policy. Eisenhower had dictated the reasoning himself in a memo to his chief of staff. The memo was later declassified and is now part of the public record. It read, in part, the German people claim they did not know what was happening in these camps. Whether they knew or not is irrelevant. They will know now, and they will help bury the dead. By April 16th, that order was being carried out across Germany. If you believe these stories need to be told with precision and respect for the people who lived them, subscribe. We don't sensationalize. We document. And we get the details right. The yard behind the crematorium was where the bodies had been stacked before burning. The SS guards had fled Buchenwald on April 10th, leaving over 300 corpses in the open. The Americans had left them there intentionally, untouched, preserved as evidence. They were still there when the townspeople arrived. The bodies were piled in rows. They were naked, emaciated, tangled together. Some had been dead for days. Some had died hours before liberation. The spring sun had begun the process of decomposition. The smell was overwhelming. The guards formed the civilians into a line and made them walk past the pile slowly, single file, close enough to see faces. Greta Holtz, the woman who had tried to cover her nose earlier, fainted halfway down the line. 2 guards carried her to the side, laid her on the ground, and waited for her to regain consciousness. When she woke, they brought her back to the line and made her finish. Heinrich Bauer stopped walking. He turned to Captain Miller. Please, we have seen enough. Miller's answer was immediate. You haven't seen anything yet. They were taken to the storage building. Inside, there were possessions. Suitcases stacked to the ceiling, sorted by size. Clothing in piles, separated by type. Men's jackets, women's dresses, children's shoes, eyeglasses in wooden crates, thousands of pairs. Wedding rings in a metal bin. Hair, shaved from the heads of prisoners, bundled and tied with wire, ready for shipment to manufacturers who turned it into felt and thread. The guards let the civilians walk through the room without speaking. The only sound was footsteps and, occasionally, someone crying. At the far end of the building, there was a chalkboard. Written on it in German, in neat block letters, was a production log. It listed dates and quantities, kilograms of hair collected, number of gold fillings extracted, cubic meters of ash produced. It was signed at the bottom with initials and a date, April 8, 1945, 2 days before liberation. One of the German men, Otto Friedman, 36, from Weimar, read the board and then turned and vomited against the wall. The tour lasted 4 hours. When it was over, the civilians were assembled in the roll call plaza. Captain Miller stood in front of them, flanked by 2 other officers. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. You will return to Weimar now. Tomorrow, you will come back. You will bring shovels. You will dig graves for every body in that yard. You will do this under American supervision. If you refuse, you will be arrested and charged as accessories to war crimes. Do you understand? One woman, Anna Schreiber, 58, from Weimar, raised her hand. We did not do this. Miller looked at her for a long moment. You lived 4 miles away. You saw the trains. You smelled the smoke. You didn't do this. But you let it happen. No one spoke after that. The column was marched back to Weimar in silence. They arrived in the early evening. Most of them went home and did not speak to their families. Some of them did not eat. Several went to churches and sat alone in the pews until late into the night. The next morning, over 800 civilians returned to Buchenwald with shovels. They dug graves in the soft earth west of the camp under the supervision of American engineers. The graves were shallow, long trenches that could hold dozens of bodies each. The work took 3 days. The bodies were carried from the yard on stretchers, lowered into the trenches, and covered with soil. Wooden markers were placed at each grave with the date and the estimated number of dead. An American chaplain, Lieutenant Samuel Cohen, 32, from Baltimore, Maryland, said prayers over the graves in English, German, and Hebrew. The German civilians stood in rows, hats in their hands, and listened in silence. When the burials were finished, they were dismissed. They walked back to Weimar and resumed their lives. Some of them spoke about what they had seen. Most did not. The silence became a feature of the town, a thing that lived in kitchens and shops and Sunday dinners. Present but unspoken, Eisenhower's order was carried out at every major camp liberated by American or British forces. At Dachau, over 2,000 Munich residents were marched through the camp. At Mauthausen, Austrian civilians from nearby towns were brought in under guard. At Bergen-Belsen, British forces required local German officials to witness the mass graves before they were filled. The policy was controversial, even within the Allied command. Some officers argued it was collective punishment, that forcing civilians to witness atrocities they had not personally committed violated principles of justice. Eisenhower's response was documented in a letter to the War Department dated April 19, 1945. It has been preserved in the National Archives. He wrote, I have been told that the German people claim ignorance of these crimes. I do not care if they were ignorant. I care that they are ignorant no longer. The only way to prevent this from happening again is to make it impossible to deny that it happened at all. The photographs taken during the forced marches were distributed to newspapers across the United States and Europe. Images of German civilians walking past piles of corpses appeared on front pages in New York, London, Paris. The captions were brief and factual. German civilians view evidence of atrocities at Buchenwald concentration camp. The reaction was mixed. Some readers supported the policy. Others called it cruel. But the images were undeniable. The evidence was undeniable. And that, in the end, was the point. In November 1945, when the Nuremberg trials began, the footage and photographs from Buchenwald were entered into evidence. Testimonies from survivors were heard. Documents were presented, and the German civilians who had been marched through the camp were referenced in the prosecution's opening statement as proof that the crimes had been witnessed, documented and acknowledged by the German population itself. Greta Holtz, the woman who fainted in the yard, was interviewed in 1963 by a researcher from the University of Heidelberg. The interview was recorded and later transcribed. She was asked if she had known what was happening at Buchenwald before the Americans forced her to see it. Her answer was quiet. We knew there was a camp. We knew prisoners were there. We told ourselves it was none of our business. After the Americans made us look, we couldn't tell ourselves that anymore. The graves at Buchenwald are still there. The camp is now a memorial site. Over 500,000 people visit each year. The barracks have been preserved. The crematorium is open to the public. The roll call plaza is empty now, a wide space of stone and dirt where guided tours pause and guides explain what happened there. There is a plaque near the gate, installed in 1958, with a quote from Eisenhower. It reads, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever. In the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. He knew, even then, that people would try to deny it, that the scale of the crime would make it unbelievable, that photographs could be dismissed, testimonies questioned, documents called forgeries. So he made the Germans see it, not because it was kind, because it was necessary. These stories are not easy to tell, but they are true. They are documented, and they matter. If you believe that's worth preserving, subscribe. We'll keep telling them the right way.